The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
So, well, thank you very much. Thank you particularly for coming out on this freezing night and sharing all of this and just being here. So good. Well, consciousness, which is the subject of our evening, is a rather murky subject. And you can read a great deal about it and hear a great deal about it without going away any the wiser. You can read entire books. What is consciousness? Consciousness explained. Well, it turns out consciousness is like a computer. Oh yeah, really? What does that mean? I always wonder with like computers, for example. John Searle, who's like one of the most distinguished philosophers of mind in recent years, said that each age tends to conceptualize the mind in terms of its dominant technology. In Freud's time, the dominant technology was the engine, the steam engine, the dynamo it was called in those days. And so how did Freud conceive of the mind? Well, he conceived of it as the id, you know, this enormous collection of drives with this lid called the superego on it that served as kind of a valve or something like that, and so on, so on. Now, the dominant image of our time, the dominant technology of our time is the computer. So it goes without saying that philosophers of mind are going to tend to think of things in terms of computers. And there's always the question of AI, as it's called, artificial intelligence. That is to say, if it's all just a bunch of complicated calculations in your head, can a computer ever be devised that will replicate or attain consciousness like ours? And whether you believe in this or not may say something about your philosophical prejudices. It says nothing about any actuality because no computer has gotten to the point of being able to do that. Nonetheless, computers outdo us in various things. A computer can do calculations a lot more efficiently than the human mind can, and a lot more unerringly. It can, for example, beat just about anybody in the world at chess. I think there was a point at which, you know, this IBM mainframe or whatever it was beat, you know, the living chess master or whatever. Nonetheless, there are a lot of things in the human mind that don't seem to be terribly well replicated or replicable in these strings of zeros and ones. For example, Catullus, who's a Latin Roman poet of the 1st century BC, wrote a little epigram. He was a very ardent love poet and probably died young. And you know, he said, "I hate and love. Why do you do this, you may ask? I don't know, but I feel it happen and I am in anguish." Now, this is a human sentiment. To be able to feel something like this, and probably all of us have at some point or another, is arguably a mark of what makes us human. How exactly would a computer be able to replicate this emotional conflict? How would it be able to, you know, resolve totally contradictory ideas and hold them at the same time? Good question. Some of you may remember in the 70s, there was kind of a parodical science fiction movie called Dark Star. And it was actually a pretty funny movie. These guys somewhere up in space are being threatened by some kind of, you know, Star Wars like Death Star, you know, death machine. And they're cornered and they don't really know how to defeat it. So they start talking to it, and they start talking phenomenology to it. And eventually it gets so confused and its wires get so crossed that it blows itself up. And so you can well imagine that a computer might be able to do that. So the computer as a model of human consciousness, you know, may be somewhat limited. And all the other models of human consciousness that are, you know, somewhat mechanical may also be limited. There's another little issue going on here, which is the mind-brain problem. Is the mind just the functioning of the brain? Now, if you go to a typical university and you talk to a typical philosophy professor, or I suppose a typical neurologist, you would say, yeah, it is. Consciousness is not possible without the functioning of the brain. Take that as you will, but somehow no one has yet managed to figure out how this combination of what we experience arises out of these physical events. The mind, as one psychologist said, resembles the brain about as much as a telephone number resembles its subscriber. So now the answer, the official answer, the official academic answer is we haven't figured that out yet, but we're just about to, or we will real soon. So you've got all these philosophers of mind waiting around like Vladimir and Estragon for this vindication of materialism. And materialism in the sense is basically, in this technical philosophical sense, means like, that the brain is the mind and vice versa. This has lots of problems, notably the fact that no one exactly figures out how this has worked itself out. And it turns out, well, if you want to believe in materialism, you're going to have to believe that they're going to find the answer, which is, as much a matter of faith as any religious dogma. So it's kind of a question of choose your dogma. It's never put that way. Here's Daniel Dennett, who's probably, one of the most distinguished philosophers, Sweet Dreams, Philosophical Obstacles to an Idea of Consciousness and Science of Consciousness. And, it's all figured out already, except not really. I was just looking at the end of it. Here's the end. There are many properties of conscious states that can and should be subjected to further scientific investigation right now, and once we get accounts of them in place, we may well find that they satisfy us as an explanation of what consciousness is.
Or not.
So there you have it. That's kind of the latest. This book is, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years old, so it's fairly close to it. So the problem of consciousness hasn't really been solved too well. Moreover, the problem of how this thing called human consciousness, this supposedly privileged and unique thing, arises out of everything else, is even less understood. And that's where the discipline is now. The question that's the title of the lecture is, what is consciousness? Well, the definition you'll get, it will tend to be somewhat circular. What's consciousness? Well, it's awareness. What's awareness? Well, it's perception. What's perception? Well, it's consciousness. Okay. It's like defining left and right. It's the opposite of right. It's the opposite of left. It doesn't tell you too much if you don't already have some idea of what it is. A circular definition isn't really a definition. So one of the things I wanted to do in this book is pose a definition of consciousness that I think is not circular, and I think it's readily understandable, and I think it goes far to answering and explaining a lot of these issues that have just been mentioned by me. And just simply this: consciousness is the capacity to relate self and other. That is to say, all consciousness, as we experience it, has some self-other quality to it. And this goes deeper than one may normally think. Now, my consciousness as a self here, to some degree, even though I'm not aware of it on a moment-by-moment basis, something to do with the sense of me here and you there, this room here, these objects here, whatever kind of metaphysical reality they might have. If I'm totally unaware of that, I couldn't be said to be conscious. Now, this is an interesting thing because it suggests that consciousness in a lot of different ways may be more pervasive than we might ordinarily think. are you conscious in a dream? Well, no, not in a sense of ordinary waking consciousness, but I think we can all, and I would ask you to grant this, if you will, that our waking consciousness is one of like many bandwidths of experience that we have. Some Hindu philosophers say that the only reason that we think this world is the real one and the dream world is the illusory one is that we spend more time in this one. You know, we're awake 2/3 of the day, theoretically, and sleep only 1/3. But even in a dream, there's a sense of self and other, right? There are these characters in this dream. There are these beings, these places. And so there's some kind of awareness, some kind of perception. In meditative states, many though not all meditative states, there's still images that come up, thoughts that surface, emotions that surface, and so on. So when you start to look at things this way, human waking consciousness, is real. That is to say, if it isn't, there's not much else we can say or do. But it's not unique or privileged in any particular way. It's just one of many types of consciousness that we ourselves experience. I suppose you could even say mind instead of consciousness if you find that more useful. For some reason, mind has gotten to be such a vague term that I haven't really used it very much. But you could. So you've got this world of self and other. And this creates kind of interesting things. I mean, a lot of spiritual teachings get into this point where, well, this self and other thing is not quite what you think. Normally, what we identify with is a certain kind of collection of drives, thoughts, images, emotions, ideas that collectively could be referred to as the ego. And we think this is us. And throughout much of day-to-day life, waking life, we function as though this is ourselves. But, and I would say that a lot, if not many, if not most meditative practices are designed to kind of foster this insight. You can always step back from and watch these things. There's the meditative exercise. You stop and you can watch, all these thoughts passing like images on a screen. Well, if you can watch this, it must not be you, huh? So what is you, really? Well, the mystical traditions, some of them are more explicit about this than others would say. There is this kind of silent watcher, this pure self, this pure awareness that is there. And you can never see it because it's always that which sees. And if you realize this, you'll start to understand, various mystical texts will have very cryptic statements like this one from St. Francis, which I use as the epigraph to Inner Christianity. What you are looking for is what is looking. Now, in a certain sense, that's an utterly baffling, confusing statement. But just in the light of what I've said, it actually makes a lot of sense. That in you that you're looking for is what's doing the looking, and it's always there. And so then you start seeing things like, well, you can never lose it. You're always here. You don't have to go anywhere. You're here now. You're already there. All this kind of thing that, utterly meaningless in any kind of ordinary discourse. But in the light of some insight like this, start to become quite clear. And the whole thing about spiritual practice is that to one degree or another, it kind of at the beginning awakens this insight, and then kind of fosters and deepens it. So you become more and more free of all of these things you mistakenly think you are. This doesn't make them vanish you know, and so that you kind of evaporate into a poof of nothingness. But it does give you a certain kind of freedom and flexibility in regard to them. And again, that's a great deal of what the sort of punchline of many spiritual traditions are, with detachment in some sort of way. The kind of the crowning kind of scripture in Hindu thought is the Bhagavad Gita, which eventually the outcome is, just to kind of posit, kind of impersonal, selfless action as kind of the key to awakening. That is to say, you don't just sit there and do nothing, but in a sense, you're free from attachment to the results of your actions, and you can act much more cleanly. So that, I would say, is to some degree what consciousness is, this sense of the capacity to relate self and other. And there are terms for it in various Hindu traditions. And I guess I'll use a couple from the Hindu Sankhya tradition. This is the oldest philosophical school known to humanity. Anything that looks like a philosophical school, something that's not just myth. I mean, this was before Buddhism, and most people say that Buddha was influenced by it to some degree. What does it mean? Well, it means something like analysis. And some of it is in the sense of this kind of detachment that I've been talking about, but also it is a philosophical system, so there's a lot of categorization and breaking things down into parts. I'm not going to go into this a great deal. What would be the opposite of analysis? Okay, synthesis. Putting things together. Integration. Well, there's another school of Hindu philosophy that means something like this. And that's called yoga. Probably not many of you have heard of the Sankhya. Practically all, well, I would say every, who here has not heard of yoga? Okay. Now, these look very different, but originally they were the same. This was the theory and this was the practice. And again, going back to the Bhagavad Gita, there's one point at which Krishna says, whoever says Sankhya and yoga are different is an error, because they are the same. In those days, when that was written, which was around, I don't know, they don't really know the date, but say 200 BC, those were kind of part of the same thing. Later, they did diverge and became different schools, but originally they were the same. One was the theory and one was the practice. And this awareness, this kind of pure principle of consciousness, in the Sankhya is called Purusha, or Purush, as it's usually pronounced. And what does it mean? Well, it means that principle of awareness. And it doesn't really do too much. Why? Because it's just there. It's just aware. It's totally actionless. All doing is from the other side of the coin. And this is the name for it. Sometimes, depending how it's translated, it's prakriti or prakriti. And what is that? The sum total of what is experienced by you, by everybody. This is usually translated nature, but it doesn't really mean nature in any sense it's normally used. It's much more encompassing. You know, the world out there, the world, trees and birds and bees and all that sort of thing is part of Prakriti, but then so is your experience. So are the dream characters, your fantasies, your ideas, abstract mathematical axioms, and so on, so on, so on. They're all part of this Prakriti, this world. in esoteric Christianity, if you're interested in that, the world is probably the closest. In fact, it's a fairly close correspondence to this. So when you go through, say, the Gospel of John, it starts talking about the world. Well, he was in the world, but the world knew him not. Well, what is that? Well, the world never knows because it's what is known. This, by the way, would be called the Logos. So the word, there's this contrast between the Logos and the world at the beginning of the Gospel of John. And that's what this is. It's saying it a little differently and a little bit more obscurely, but it comes to the same thing. Prakriti is everything you experience. But since this doesn't just belong to you, this is present in you, it's present in me, and what I'm going to attempt to argue, it's present in everything. It's the sum total of what all of this experiences anywhere, whether it's you or a bug or a hydrogen atom. And that's why, to go back to this concept of consciousness, the capacity to relate self and other, everything that exists has to have some measure of this. Everything has to have some measure of itself, some measure of awareness of itself as opposed to some other, in order to simply hold together. Like this plant. Is this plant conscious in the way you and I are? No, probably not. Or I could be wrong. If so, I hope you won't take any offense. But it has a capacity to cohere. It doesn't fall apart when I touch it. So in its atoms, in its cells, there is this capacity. And this also makes a great deal of sense in terms of the mystical traditions, because you read, something like, Theosophy or many mystical traditions where it says, spirit is in everything. Well, yeah, if you pull something apart, you're not going to find any spirit in it. And that's why the materialists think that the esoteric, mystical view of the world has been refuted, because, we're taking this brain apart, and we don't see any little man inside. Well, no, because it's in everything. It's in all levels, even in apparently inanimate things. It takes, for example, some consciousness on the part of a hydrogen atom to recognize an oxygen atom under certain circumstances and react with it to form water. Why? Well, if a hydrogen atom were put next to a sodium atom, it wouldn't react that way. This is not, introspective, self-aware consciousness like, that of like a Woody Allen character or something, but it is consciousness of a kind. And you can find, here it is. This is an excerpt from an 1890 interview with Thomas Edison. I do not believe that matter is inert, acted upon by an outside force. To me, it seems that every atom is possessed by a certain amount of primitive intelligence. Look at the thousands of ways in which atoms of hydrogen combine with those of other elements, forming the most diverse substances. Do you mean to say that they do this without intelligence? Gathered together in certain forms, the atoms constitute animals of the lower orders. Finally, they combine in man, who represents the total intelligence of all the atoms. To which the interviewer says, but where does this intelligence come from originally? From some power greater than ourselves. So this was a thing that I think occurred intuitively to Edison. And I think it occurred intuitively to many thinkers and who put it in very different ways. This way, the thing about Hindu philosophy is that it's much clearer and more precise and much more capable of dealing with many different levels and types of experience than Western philosophy is. Why that's so, I don't know, but I think it may be just that they had the Vedic religion and the esoteric traditions that were a part of that gave it a certain structure. And Western philosophy became so constrained by certain types of rationalism that it eventually just started to be like a little, a toy soldier that's running against the wall, making up, of course, ever more complicated phrases and systems to disguise the fact that it's running up against a wall. But, so you have this Purusha and Prakriti, and everything is under one of those two categories. Sankhya is an analysis. Well, this is analysis. There's that which experiences and that which is experienced. There's nothing else, at least not in any kind of world at which we can say anything about. Even a lie, even a total delusion, is experienced. I mean, if you're a lunatic having hallucinations, God telling you to go out with a gun and shoot up a schoolyard, you're having an experience, right? It is real as an experience. So I would say, obviously a lot of people here are interested in theosophy, and a lot of times I think when, people like the secret doctrine talk about spirit and matter, it's best to see it in this way. If you see matter in a very conventional, materialistic way, some of those ideas become a little harder to understand. So that is the analysis of everything. I mean, this goes a lot further. I mean, and it has like 25 different categories, which I'm not going to go into here. But there's that which experiences and that which is experienced. Now, none of this is fixed because you're experiencing something. You're in some ways, at some point of view, you look like this, and some point of view, you're this. Things are constantly flipping back and forth, right? Like that game Othello, where you put down the disc, like it's white on one side and black on the other, and if you cap the ends, it'll turn around. So things flip back and forth. Which is why solipsism isn't true. Solipsism, I'm sure it's familiar to some of you. It basically means only I exist. How do I know that I haven't just dreamed all of you up in my head? Even if you tell me you haven't, well, that could just be my delusion too. I mean, no philosopher holds this seriously. If you feel your reasoning kind of takes you into this corner, it means you've gotten something wrong. I mean, I've never heard of anyone advocating this seriously. If they do, they're probably in a home somewhere. So this Purush, this kind of awareness, this capacity is not just in you or me as cognizing human beings. It's in everything. And this has various consequences if you think it out. For one thing, it is a bit damaging to that prop of human vanity known as our sense of uniqueness. Humans are the only beings that humans are the only beings that ... right? They're the only, well, no, we're not really the only beings that use tools. No, we're not really the only beings who use language, and so on and so on. A lot of this privilege, has been kind of eroded. And so you could say that we're not the only beings who are conscious. We are the only beings who are conscious in a particular type of way. But as I think we all know, dolphins, whales, dogs, cats, have some kind of consciousness and awareness, some capacity to relate self and other, even, which is sometimes like ours, and sometimes not. I mean, dogs and cats, their ability to reason is fairly primitive, but their emotional lives, their capacity to respond emotionally are, remarkably close to our own. This goes into, plants. The bestseller of the 70s, The Secret Life of Plants. Plants have this capacity as well. And I'm reading a book by David Spangler, sort of like one of the pioneers of the New Age, who, a fascinating book. And he talks about, well, that you have this kind of sense of this subtle field and almost kind of an awareness, even in, things like your sofa. And, as you know, there are rooms that have certain types of feeling about them. There's some of this in many different layers in everything. And very likely, the bandwidth that we're able to see is just a tiny part of it. Just the way we all know that we can only see a very narrow bandwidth of color. But the light spectrum, goes on. Bees can see colors we can't, and so on. So this erodes the sense of human uniqueness, but it also erodes the sense of human isolation. Because suddenly, if you're not the only beings who are conscious for reasons we don't understand, because going back to the materialistic philosophy, none of this has been explained. It's just some sort of like fluke of evolution. We don't have to hold to that anymore. We can say, well, yeah, our consciousness is one type of many that's embedded in the universe in many different layers and different levels. You don't have to then explain how human consciousness came out of, supposedly popped out of nothing. What about things like AI, artificial intelligence? Well, does a computer have a capacity to recognize self and other? Yeah, in a certain way. The idea that you're going to create a computer that's entirely like a human being seems rather far-fetched, but that there's some kind of cognition, in a computer. Then, as we all know, machines seem to have their own wills and personalities sometime, and I don't think that's totally illusory. So if you want to go in that direction, you're not kind of forced into it. I mean, most people who don't want to go into a strong AI direction are somehow attached to a sense of human uniqueness and privilege and all that sort of thing. We're the only things that are conscious. But it may be that at some point or another it will end up being, like some Arnold Schwarzenegger movie or something like that. As I say, it's unlikely that it'll be entirely like ours, but it's not really limited either. So I think these are some of the implications of this. And as I say, going back to this, this has kind of been around for a long, long time. The Sankhya is, well, supposedly it's extinct. The kind of leading scholar of the Samkhya in the English-speaking world said that he thought it was extinct, and then he went down some street in India and saw some school that was teaching Sankhya Yoga, by the way. It's called Sankhya Yoga. So it isn't totally extinct. But this all starts to sound very dualistic, right? And Sankhya is considered like a dualistic system. I'm using this because it just happens to, of the systems that I've experienced and explored, in some ways it's the one that comes closest to my own insights. I don't have any vested interest in promoting it. Although I have to say there's some advantage in doing something that's totally obsolete, because you don't have like a bunch of people telling you you're not an authentic, representative of this and that, I mean, I at times in my life taught the Kabbalah, and, well, what sort of credentials do you have to teach the Kabbalah, blah, 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 blah. or to teach esoteric Christian, or to, Theosophy or Buddhism or something. And the usual answer is that you have to have some enormous string of lineages and credentials that, of course, mean exactly nothing. I mean, speaking of degrees from prestigious universities, you can certainly hold those and be a complete idiot, and I've certainly known plenty of people who have. Just the way you can be, a legitimate Dharma lineage holder and be a complete, clown and jerk, as has been known to happen. And I suppose this is a sideline, but it's an important one. I suppose I was always taught that at some point in you, you have to be able to speak the truth in your own name. And it also implies that you have the capacity to recognize the truth when someone else speaks it. I'm not talking about factual truths, I'm talking about deep truths. There's a curious verse in the Bible that Jesus is talking, and the people were amazed at him, for he spoke as one having authority and not as the scribes. And this is very much about the issue that I just brought up. The scribes are the people with all the credentials. And they mean something, but they don't mean as much as the scribes like to think they do. And Jesus didn't talk that way. He wasn't going around. He spoke as, in a sense, as a truth coming out of himself, and the people recognized and responded to that. Now, that verse has an interesting corollary that isn't often noticed, which is there had to be something in the people that recognized authority, right? They could tell the difference between someone who really was speaking truth and, people who were just, babbling things out of some book they read once. And what I'd like to suggest to you, and maybe this is the only thing you remember or take home from this, I would certainly be perfectly happy. There is something in you that recognizes and acknowledges this truth. You don't necessarily need to develop it. You may need to be reminded that you have it. And if that strikes home for anyone, I think I'll consider my time well spent. But let me go back to something about this dualism business. Dualism, have you noticed how dualism is a bad thing? Dualism is always characterized as kind of a bad thing. That's all very dualistic. Matthew Fox, who's sort of this renegade priest, sort of wrote one of these books denouncing dualism. It was really charming. He had like this helpful 2-column list of things that were dualistic and things that weren't. Of course, criticizing dualism is itself dualistic. Even to say something you're non-dualistic is dualistic because you're saying something that there's dualism that your thing, whatever it is, isn't. So dualism is considered to be a bad thing, sort of the way 2 is often considered to be an unlucky number. Remember the $2 bill that no one would take because it was somehow unlucky for some reason? The deuce is a synonym for the devil, that kind of thing. So in a sense, there is this duality. Of course, it is the case that, as all of these traditions say, there is a reality behind the self and other. There is a level out of which this comes, and it has many names, like Brahman or the Kabbalistic Ein Sof, the infinite. Meister Eckhart, who is the Christian mystic of the 14th century, called it the Godhead. There's something behind all of this duality out of which it arises. Now, the problem is you can't really say anything about it because, of course, you say anything about it, it immediately becomes dualistic. And, that's why, the Tao that can be spoken of is not the Tao. So suddenly, if you kind of, get this insight, a lot of these, again, these paradoxes and obscurities become a lot clearer. So you're not going to be able to talk about it, but there are levels and ways in which you can experience, and I think most people do. I mean, I think most people have moments of awakening, moments of insight, moments of illumination, whether or not they have any kind of formal spiritual practice or not. The difficulty is not so much having them as recognizing them for what they are, or at least seeing there's something in them. You know, like little moments of awakening or insight, or just as, a sense just for a second or so that you're just not quite as asleep as you are most of the time. You can foster this by practice and meditation, that sort of thing, but you can also foster it by not denigrating it, by not setting it aside and just saying, oh, well, that wasn't anything. You have to honor your own insights. And people read books and go to lectures and talk to each other, if only to get some sense of what their own experience might have been about, or at least talk to people about who may have had similar ones. But anyway, so there's this unity out of which this kind of duality arises, and you can't really say a great deal about it. Although you can experience it. And, Brahman is the Hindu word for it. Now, it's funny. And the great, as you know, Hinduism and Buddhism are not the same thing. And actually, although they don't seem to have any huge conflicts at the moment, except places like Sri Lanka, they had a long tradition of debate and argument. And, the Buddhists call the Hindus the Tirthakas, which means something like heretics. Although, since the Hindus were there first, it's probably the Buddhists that were heretics, but that never stops anybody. And what it comes down to is the great difference between these two religions, which are remarkably similar, much more similar than, say, Judaism and Christianity, is this one little issue of self. And here's the Hindu word for self, Atman. Atman is something like this. It's the sum totality of all of this. Brahman is Atman and Atman is Brahman, right? Well, the Buddhists don't agree with this. The fundamental concept of Buddhism is what they call anatta, which means no self. The Hindus, heretics that they are, believe in this thing called self, but we say there is no self. And that is the great difference. That's the chief thing that keeps them being separate. But you can see that this self is, in a way, it's not a very limited self. You probably could just as well call it no self, or mind, or openness. Shunyata is a term for it. So they're probably talking about the same thing. They're probably arguing about it different ways. Now, they would vehemently deny this. I was going to quote a Tibetan text in context of this in the book, and I needed to get permission from the publisher. And I knew the publisher. I knew the guy who ran it. I wrote to him and I said, hey, can I have this? He said, well, could I see the context in which it appears? And I sent it in, and he said, since I'm saying that Hinduism and Buddhism are saying the same thing, he wouldn't let me use it. This created no problems because it was just easy to go down to the Alcott library and just find another book that said the same thing, for which I didn't need to get permission, so it didn't really cause me any trouble. But you see how attached people can get to these perspectives. And going back to the idea of attachment, you could say that our personal existence, as we conceive it, is kind of the identification of this with this. You think, as the saying goes, you become what you behold. You think you are what you see. Now, one thing that people usually ask me, in regard to this book, is the story of the Dice Game of Shiva. What is it about? And it's a myth in which Shiva or Shiva, the dictionary I think has Shiva first, but I don't know, somehow it's never really sounded very natural to say that. Shiva, as I will insist on saying, and his consort Parvati are sort of shown this funny little dice game, which is actually turns out to be kind of a form of strip parcheesi. The loser has to give up something. And the joke, Shiva, who's the Lord of the universe, right? The omnipotent, limitless God, always loses. He loses every single time. His wife, Parvati, wins, and she wins everything. She wins his loincloth, his trident, who's his most essential attributes. And, he said, well, that's all right. And then he goes, I'm kind of an ascetic anyway, so he goes off in to the woods and meditate. And eventually she gets bored and finds him again and so on and so on. But why should Shiva lose? And I would say it's a metaphor for this. Anything you can see belongs to, this is Parvati, the world. Anything you can see is part of the world experience. It's not this. And the more it's kind of a stripping away process. This has nothing, it's just awareness, but it can't lose anything either. Mind, consciousness, in some form or another is always going to persist. That in you which says I is kind of a gateway, say, to the universal. It's kind of your link with God in a certain sense. And one thing I would argue is in the language of Christianity, this explains a lot about the Gospel of John, and it's rather mysterious I am statements. I am the door. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. What I think that means in a deeper sense is that it's not talking about Jesus personally, because it becomes rather hard to swallow that if you're talking about, some guy who lived, we don't even really know very much about 2,000 years ago. But that in you which says I am is the door to higher dimensions still. I am is the true vine. It's your connection to everything. I am is the way, the truth, and life, and so on. And if you view it in that sense, all of that starts to feel very true. I am is sort of the gateway to the Father. No man cometh to the Father is Brahman. No one man cometh to the Father but by me. No one goes into that except through I am. I and the Father are one, but the Father is greater than I. All of the Gospel of John, viewed in this light, becomes like a commentary on some of these ideas and becomes a lot more insightful and profound than if you try to attach certain kind of very narrow sectarian views to it, at least in my opinion. So I think you can take these ideas very far and go into them. I think it's not necessarily a matter of accepting or rejecting them, because accepting or rejecting, is just it's just a little bit part of, the dice game of Prakriti. If you're willing to contemplate something, any truth it has eventually it will seep into you, and you don't have to either accept it or push it away. So on that score, I think I will stop. It's about 8 o'clock. Questions, comments?
Could you say something more about Sankhya? What the philosophy of Sankhya that
would you be kind enough for the recording?
Can you say something about Sankhya philosophy?
Well, this is the essence of it, but there are lots of sub-combinations of it. The next step is this kind of, no, it isn't. My mistake. kind of the next step is called this, buddhi. And buddhi is sometimes translated intellect, and sometimes it's translated intuition. None of these are particularly good. But it is kind of a pure cognition, a pure awareness that's not entirely fettered. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Kabbalah, but the Kabbalistic concept of Binah is similar to that. In the old philosophies of the West, in the scholastic philosophies, this was called intellectus, which doesn't mean intellect as we know it. When someone like Thomas Aquinas uses the word intellectus, it's not quite translatable as intellect. So there's, well, to define buddhi in a kind of denotative way, sometimes in the morning you have, when you just wake up for a second or two, you're aware and you're awake. Maybe you're even more aware and awake than usual. But everything kind of feels good. Everything feels unproblematic. And then you remember who you are. And then you remember your problems. And then the whole mess starts. I would say, in the language of the Sankhya, that moment of kind of pure cognition, just kind of being aware before you comes in, would be equivalent to buddhi. What comes after that? Well, here's their word for it. Ahamkara, which means I-ness. That is to say, I kind of come back, I, Richard Smoley, with all of his problems and neuroses and that sort of thing. And, that kind of pure moment is lost, and, you become, who you are, who you think you are, unfortunately. Those are the next two stages in the analysis. After that, they start getting into 5 capacities for sense, 5 senses, 5 elements, 5 subtle elements, 5 material elements. There's supposed to be 25, and I've just given you 24. And I can never remember what the 25th is, so you'll have to forgive me. But that's a rough breakdown of it. It's said to have existed. Some of the earlier Upanishads reflect the Sankhya, and they were written, say, composed between 7 and 500 BC. The later version, the texts we have are considerably later, but it is still considered to be very ancient. So that's like a rundown, just a very brief rundown of it. Yeah.
So would you say that there's different levels or states of consciousness, and within those there are different laws that govern those? And would you say at some point that which experiences and that which is experienced, do they collapse on themselves at some point?
Yeah, I would say so. The question regarding the laws in which these different levels operate. Again, the most obvious example is the dream state. The dream state, in dreams, things happen. In some ways, the state is like the waking state, right? There are people, places, things happen. There's time in a way, there's space in a way. But on the other hand, the laws are not identical. Things aren't quite as distinct as they are. And let's see if I can find this quickly. There's a passage in here. It's quoted from Anna Karenina that talks about it. Here it is. Prince Stepan Oblonsky wakes up on a sofa in the study where he's had to sleep because he's had a fight with his wife, because she just caught him with the governess. Let's see, how was it, he said to himself as he tried to recall his dream. How was it now? Yes, Alabin had us to dinner in Darmstadt. No, not Darmstadt. Something American. No, this Darmstadt was in America. That's it. Allah gave a dinner on glass tables. And I'll be dashed at the tables and sing. Il mio tesoro. No, not il mio. Something even better. Pretty little wine glasses, and the wine glasses were ladies. And because Tolstoy is a genius, my opinion, there is something about this that represents what a dream is kind of like. The wine glasses are ladies. They're different, but they're not. Identity is a lot less distinct in a dream state, or a fantasy daydream state, which is similar. So there are laws, and there are different laws that operate at these different levels. The mystical traditions talk about, levels even beyond these where distinctions of self and other are even more tenuous. And as you say, they do either collapse upon each other or they sort of merge. And again, these are kind of subtle meditative states, and it can be hard. I think most people have had some experience of them somewhere along the line. To have like a really kind of full conscious experience of them can be sometimes a bit, you have to have kind of special circumstances. I mean, even, meditating a half hour a day, which is kind of it's good, but if you really wanted to get into some of this, you have to do some enormous retreat or something like that. I'm not even saying that's necessary, but I'm saying that's what's done. People, enclose themselves in kind of very special monastic settings or retreat settings in order to be able to investigate some of these things a little more clearly. Yeah.
I've heard that Buddhism differs from Hinduism in the sense that the Buddhists emphasize right actions and good behavior. They don't have any gods. The Hindus have multiple gods and relate themselves to their gods. Having that in mind, would you say that one of those religions emphasizes consciousness more than the other?
No, and even the couple of things you said, I might take issue with. One is, in Hinduism, there is this doctrine of karma, which is action, and karma in accordance with what's called dharma, or universal law. That is to say, doing what's right in the circumstances. So there's a fair amount of emphasis on action. There is a difference in their attitude toward the gods, because both religions have gods and say gods exist. The Buddhists have a much more hands-off attitude toward their gods. The gods are very long-lived beings who are enjoying the fruits of good karma. And since they're having such a good time, they're really not going to be bothered with you too much. And even if they could be, they're really on the same whirl of the wheel of life and death as you are. Once their good karma wears out, they're going to go down to the hell realms and, back up again. So you don't really want to have any truck with them. Whereas the Hindus, as far as I can tell, or many Hindus, have a real relationship with gods, much as people do in other faiths. So I think those are some. Hinduism is a very rich and diverse thing. Basically anything can be found in it somewhere. These very abstract ideas, the Advaita Vedanta, which is kind of the most familiar form of Hindu philosophy in the West, sometimes condemned by other Hindus as being just Buddhism in disguise. They're gods, they're, weird sacrifices, they're the spider people. They're the spider people. I only went to India once, but when I did, a friend of mine who had lived there for a while said, "You should check out the spider people." Okay. And I didn't make any direct effort to, but I think I saw them. They were in a temple somewhere, I think it was in Kanchipuram, which is in the south near Madras, near Chennai. I don't know if that's what they were or not, but they ran around on all fours like monkeys, and they had these very elongated arms and legs. And I don't know if that's what he was talking about, but he said that the spider people were a particular caste of untouchable whose parents broke their arms and legs at the age when they were like a week old, so that they would be lame and thus more evocative of alms. It's a rich, wild, intricate faith, and I think you could, there may be 1 billion Hindus in the world or something like that. It's like the Catholic Church. You can find just about anything there, some corner or another. So another. Over.
Just a second, I'll come back.
What is really then new and pushing the envelope in your understanding of consciousness? From where to what are you defining yourself as being new? What's the background? What is the old? What is the new? What is it that it might be solving that has not been solved? Where are you specifically thinking you're pushing the envelope?
But I didn't say I was pushing the envelope. Somebody else did.
False advertising.
Well, I didn't even say it. Well, I guess I would kind of refer you to some of the things I've said already, one of which is that consciousness is not kind of a unique, privileged human thing. Moreover, in my own kind of humble self-defense, I say that even to give like a coherent, non-circular definition of consciousness is more than most thinkers have done. And to explain it in a reasonably clear way in some reference to the kind of fabric not only of human experience but of the universe is, I don't know, I think it's something. You may not agree.
I still have to go to the good read.
Okay.
Yes, going back to the Hindu-Buddhist theme here. Self and the non-self. Mm-hmm. The Hindu being the self or more awareness of the consciousness, where the Hindu is the non-self but more conscious of, I guess, the more broader consciousness.
Yeah. Well, the thing about it is that if you, the Buddhist view is something like this. And frankly, their explanation is not always that clear either sometimes. But their argument is something like this. Well, you think you're a self, but really you're just this kind of atomic collection of thoughts, feelings, ideas, emotions, that sort of thing, that have no integrated whole. You're just this bundle, and they use the term bundle, skandhas, for these things that supposedly make up the self. And all you have to do is sort of pull the string, and they fall apart, and there's no you anymore, and mind is kind of liberated. That's kind of the idea. Now, I don't know. I'm not sure I buy that. The idea, here's a classic Buddhist argument. Well, are you less of yourself if you cut off your hand? No, you're not. Or if you cut off both of your hands? No. Is there some point, how much of your body can you cut off before you're no longer you? And I think you have to say that even though you may not be able to pinpoint the exact moment where this kind of process of reduction ends, there's still something that's a whole, that's in the whole, that's not in the parts. I think you have to say, and I would argue, that if I dump a carload of auto parts in your driveway, all of which are in perfect condition and all of which, if you put them together would make whatever, car you like, is that the same as a car? No, there's something missing. And so this whole process of analysis and cutting things back has never really made a huge amount of sense to me. And I think that's been that's kind of one of the debates. That much said, it is possible to kind of loosen, the strings of attachment to this identity. And I don't know, is it going to dissolve completely? I don't know, maybe you don't want it to dissolve completely, but I think there's something to be said for loosening it and make it a bit more flexible. I think the Hindu view is more just that there's and I don't really know. I mean, I'm not, it's always going on a limb to speak, for traditions that you don't, are not necessarily any kind of part of, but it seems to be more on this kind of this larger being that's kind of looking through you as through a telescope. And the Buddhist thing seems to be a little bit more like, well, there's really nothing there at all. It's just pure openness or mind. And I have to say the difference is, maybe almost just one of nuance. But that's the history of religion. I mean, the subtler the differences, the smaller the differences, the more vehemently people insist on it. I mean, a story I tell sometimes, I once went to a snake handler church in Tennessee Holler, which is a funny story in its own right. I won't go into the whole thing. Unfortunately, to my great disappointment, no snakes were handled at that particular service. And the guy, the preacher, who had been an ex-carnival barker and had that kind of, patter, spent most of it going on about how the snake handler church in the next holler over was all wrong. There's a big thing in between the snake handler churches about whether you baptize in the name of the Trinity or if you baptize in Jesus' name. And you'll go by a crude sign from a church, the Holiness Church in Jesus' name, and they're sort of telling you that what is this all about? Is whether you baptize in the name of the Trinity or in the name of Jesus. That's what it's about. And as Gurdjieff once said, sooner or later it all ends in people breaking one another's heads. Sadly. Anyone else? Yeah.
Do you make a distinction between awareness and consciousness, or is that just semantics? And why wouldn't spirit be down there with prakriti?
Well, that's what spirit, shall we say, is the part that is aware. These are all just words. This is kind of in everything. And curiously enough, this does all the work. I mean, this is primordially characterized as masculine, and this is primordially characterized as feminine. But the masculine thing is is totally inactive. It just is aware. Its presence, its cognition kind of makes everything go, but it's prakriti that does all the moving. The Renaissance philosophers, the occult Renaissance philosophers, call this prakriti anima mundi, the soul of the world. It's another name for it. I don't make a huge distinction between consciousness and awareness. You could say maybe awareness is a little bit less rigid or something like that, but it's unfortunately the case that English is not a language that deals very well with this sort of thing. English is a language in which is very concentrated on thingness and materiality. It's concentrated on, like the word real. Where does the word real come from? It comes from the Latin word res, meaning thing. And I do go into this in the book. I won't go much further into it here, but what we normally accept as real is associated with thingness. That isn't true necessarily in other cultures or other times. And I suspect, like for example, Germany, in German, abstract nouns seem to have a lot more force and life than they do in English. So a German philosopher can go on about Sein or Wesen, and that can be kind of rich and meaningful. It's translated in English, which is being, which is kind of a wishy-washy word, and just, being, come on. So there's always this question of thingness, and words like mind, consciousness, awareness are not very well developed. They're not very precise. And one thing that is interesting about Hindu philosophy is that it is much more precise. The analysis of mind and as it's experienced to itself, not just as a bunch of neurons, that are being, zapped by some electrode somewhere, as mind experiences itself or its own content. Their vocabulary is very impressive, and I'm sure I know only like a tiny fraction of it, but I think it'd be very interesting to learn more.
Just to follow up on the other. So if you consider the human consciousness of right, wrong, good, bad, a world of duality, if we collapse that duality, so what are you left with by your definition of what consciousness is? If you collapse them on themselves, what's left?
Well, identity starts to get rather shaky. And that's why, in a sense, all of these ideas, are so heavily defended against. The ego is a rather unstable entity, and as the Buddhists correctly point out, it's extremely impermanent, and its awareness of its own impermanence sometimes is a bit unpleasant. Where you would go beyond it is, kind of that primordial void, richness. It's not nothing. Because even to say it's nothing is to say something about it, and we just said you can't say anything about it. But it's kind of the ground, out of which all of this arises. I doubt that anyone's going to go walking down the street with any kind of, very vivid awareness of this on a moment-by-moment basis. But I do think it's possible to experience it at certain points in certain contexts, that gives your day-to-day life, your day-to-day experience a little bit more dimension and a little bit more scale. So that if nothing else, the kind of, barrage of problems and annoyances, don't occupy exactly all of your whole field of vision. Would be one practical result of it in a positive sense.
If we're talking about consciousness and spirit and matter, and spirit is not active, if you integrate spirit and matter, does matter create the action in the spirit, or does spirit create the action in the matter?
That's a good, rather intricate question. Well, let me give you the Sankhya view of it, which is that just the kind of the awareness of it starts everything going. Now, these two things are not, it's not a chicken and egg thing. These things, shall we say, come into being together.
What activates what?
Well, to give you the textbook answer, the consciousness activates everything in experience. The Sankhya would say, well, Purusha doesn't do anything, but by its mere proximity to this, it sets everything going. I don't know that I would accept that totally simplistically. It's a textbook answer. But the whole point is that the interplay and interpenetration between these, and as I say, these are not, I'm not really using these words in the sense that you necessarily would see in the dictionary. I'm saying the reason I put them on the board is that they are, particularly in works like The Secret Doctrine. I correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think these things these are used to some extent in that way, and I would not necessarily say that that's true or all that clear in the ordinary senses of those words.
In your view, would you say that consciousness evolves?
Well, that's a good question. Evolution is a very funny concept. It is, in a sense, a theosophical contribution to the esoteric traditions. Because, and I asked John Chanchosi, who's a friend who works here, who's a Buddhist monk for 20-odd years, well, is the concept of evolution present in Buddhism as you experienced it? And he didn't really seem to think it was. The idea of evolution is definitely a theme that's arisen in the esoteric traditions in the last 125 years, largely because of theosophy. Theosophy was the first to take these ideas that Darwin and Spencer were putting forth at the time and connect it to esotericism. It's an interesting story in that, and why and how that happened is interesting. Where its antecedents were would be a good question to answer, and I'm not able to. That much said, in the world as we experience it, there does seem to be some kind of increasing complexity. There does seem to be some direction to the development of consciousness, at least as we view it biologically. The theosophical idea is that everything will eventually, in a sense, evolve out of matter, having experienced matter in a somewhat cyclical way. Various other theorists, like Teilhard Chardin, who's the French Jesuit philosopher and anthropologist, said that everything is headed, that because evolution has this direction, everything is headed toward what he called an omega point, where everything, as it were, will become completely conscious. And being, essentially a Catholic and Christian, he associated this with, the last judgment, the ultimate redemption of things, although he viewed it in a very untraditional way, and for that reason, he wasn't allowed to publish anything when he was alive. Maybe one more, or is that it?
Well, time's up, and I thought I would take advantage of my position as the facilitator to make the last comment. While Richard has been talking, I've been thinking about a poem I heard recently, and it seems to resonate, although perhaps not in a very serious way. And it seems to turn upside down spirit and matter in terms of femininity and masculine or whatever. And I'm not sure I know it exactly, but here's how it goes. The point of the fish trap is the fish. Once you have the fish, you no longer need the trap. The point of the rabbit snare is the rabbit. Once you have the rabbit, you no longer need the snare. The point of words is the expression of meaning. Once you have the meaning, you no longer need the words. Oh, how I long to find a man who no longer needs the words, so that I could have a word with him.
Who wrote that?
2nd century BC Chinese.
Oh, wow. Fascinating. Actually, one thing I do want to say, which is not about any of this stuff, but I do want to make a pitch. I mean, we are doing something I think is very interesting and worthwhile at the end of April, and I do want to remind you all of it if you've heard of it, and tell you about it if you haven't. I think there is a lot of damage that has been done to people by and in the name of religion. And I think that people's attitudes toward their own spirituality will probably be helped if these wounds are healed a little bit in some kind of way, or at least someone goes in that direction. So we are putting on a conference. It's April 23rd to 25th. It's in Glen Ellen, so it's very close for anyone of you, I imagine. And it's called Healing Our Religious Wounds. and it's an attempt for people to get together, talk a little bit about their religious wounds, whether they're severe, minor, you know, ranging from even just a minor, I don't know, irritation or loss of faith or something like that. John Shelby Spong, who's a best-selling author, will be the keynote speaker. And we'll have Mo Prue, a friend of mine who was a former Roman Catholic priest who himself was abused by a priest when he was a lad. He's got some interesting things to say. Christopher Bamford, who's senior editor of Parabola and author of The Voice of the Eagle and editor of many other works, will also be there. So I would, if this topic interests you, if you feel that it resonates with you and in your experience in any sort of way, I would check it out and hopefully come to it. So thank you.